I'm Anna Carey, and I'm going to talk about how dialogue can help bring your story to life. Dialogue, just in case anyone doesn't know, is the word we use to describe the parts of a story where we show exactly what the characters are saying, the bits that are in direct speech. And it's not only a really good way for your readers to get to know your characters, but it's a really good way for you to get to know your characters as a writer. So my books are all written in the first person, and that means they're told in the voice of the main character. But it can mean that when it comes to sort of pinning down the personalities of the other characters, it's harder if you don't have that voice in your head all the time. And a good way to get inside the heads of those other characters is to put them in a scene with some dialogue. Figure out how they speak, how they relate to the other characters in the story. And that could be really helpful to you as a writer, even if it's a scene that you don't end up using in your finished story. It's a way to really liven up the narrative as well. But how do you make sure that that dialogue sounds like something that somebody would actually say? Well, my key to this is use contractions. That is the hard and fast rule that I will give when it comes to writing dialogue, because contractions are what happens when we, instead of saying I do not or I will not, we say I won't or I don't or I can't instead of cannot. And when you think about it, when people are speaking to each other, they very rarely use the full thing. They very rarely say I will not do this. They say I won't or I'll do it. And when you have dialogue in a book that has a lot of I will not or I do not think so, it could sound quite unnatural and stilted, because when you think about it, when you're speaking, most of the time, the only times when we do say I cannot or I will not or I do not is for emphasis. It's not in just a casual statement. So it's really something to bear in mind, because it really stands out when you have dialogue that doesn't use contractions, and it's a very straightforward way of making your dialogue feel more immediate and real. And you might think, but I'm setting my book in the olden days. But if you look at books that were written in the olden days, people do use contractions all the time, like Jane Austen or Dickens, or, writers writing 200 years ago were using them. So they're in direct speech. So it's really a simple way of making sure your dialogue feels naturalistic. Maybe you don't want it to feel naturalistic, and that's fine. But if you do, then it can be really effective. You might be tempted, when you're trying to make it naturalistic, to do what we call dialect, which is when you try to sort of render an accent or a way of speech by putting everything into a sort of phonetic description of the words. I think that is something to be avoided. For one, unless you're doing it for every single character every time they open their mouth, it can look like you're saying the way certain characters speak is somehow perfect and the way the other characters speak has to be rendered phonetically, which can kind of be a bit alienating. And secondly, it's really hard to do well. Most people, it's not great. And especially if you're doing a character who's from a different background to your own, it can be very patronising, and it's just really hard to get right. If you want to really indicate somebody's background or their world, you can do that with your choice of words and how they say things. You don't have to cut off the G's at the end of going or whatever, and it will be more immediate in that way, because the reader's brains don't have to work to try and figure out what accent this is supposed to be. Another key to making sure the dialogue feels naturalistic is the rhythm, because the rhythm of words on a page is almost as important as the rhythm of a song or a poem when spoken aloud. Because if you have a page that's just lines and lines of unbroken dialogue, it can feel quite airless. And it's a good thing to do is to think of ways where you can break up those blocks of dialogue. When is the best place, if you're going to put in he said or she said, when is the best place in that section of one person's speech to put that descriptive verb? And there's nothing wrong with just plain old said, by the way, when we're talking about those verbs. Where can you break up that bit of dialogue with an action. So have the first part of what they say, then she, and the quotation marks, she shrugged, or she looked away, or she fiddled with her shoe, and then continue the dialogue. So you can break up the dialogue without he said or she shouted or whatever. There's different ways to do it, and it all adds to the buoyancy and the rhythm of the scene. And at the very end of each, when you've written a bit of dialogue, the best thing to do is just read it out loud and see, can I imagine a human being, or maybe not a human being, can I imagine somebody who speaks saying these words? And it'll generally be pretty clear if, no matter who your character is, if it doesn't feel realistic. So trust your instincts, listen to how people talk, get a sense for how your characters talk, and your dialogue will really sing, and so will your story.